I have in my notes that this was the last slide from the last lecture, when we were talking about some of the historical occurrences that were leading the United States to move from the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and putting pressure on the system, and pushing them to move to a constitution, a reformulation. And what that's going to mean is that we're going to change the whole structure of federal government in the United States as we move from the Articles of Confederation to the current Constitution. Again, the first Constitutional Convention we had, we didn't have enough folks there from the states. They punted it down the road a little bit, and the next summer in Philadelphia, we got together in 1787. Again, not all of the states showed up. If I remember right, Rhode Island was a state that didn't make it, but they met anyway, which was contrary, of course, to the Articles of Confederation's the rules that were in place under that for changing or amending that Constitution. It required unanimous consent of all states. So they should not have, if they were following that Constitution, been legally meeting. But nevertheless, they thought the situation was serious enough that they did go ahead and meet and spent the summer debating what changes needed to be made and how they were going to do it. And it's, a seminal moment in the development of democracy that we have today. The glue that held these framers of the new Constitution together were three general philosophical ideas that they had in common. The first is the concept of human nature. And our founding fathers, right, coming out of a traditionally Christian perspective, at least, whether they were all traditionally Christians or not, had the idea that humans, that their actual nature was one of self-interest, one of selfishness, one of focused on the individual and how they were going to do in their life. And this was a common perspective, and I think still is, right, of who humans are. And they were debating this and talking about this and recognizing this explicitly in their discussions, that while government might aspire to some of the higher ideals of man, the folks in government were just men, right? They didn't always have the highest ideas in mind. They were in somewhat of a situation where they were concerned about their own political futures, their own economic futures. And this process of reorganizing a government is going to be an opportunity for them to build, as we talked about before, a bias into the system after their interest, after their concerns. Now, they obviously still want to design a system that's going to work into the future, and it's going to be a set of rules they can all work under and live with. But anything that they can do in this process to benefit themselves, they probably will. And so there is a recognition that from their perspective, the major drive of human behavior was self-interest. And so any government that was going to be successful over time ought to be a government that recognized, right, that drive of human nature, which is self-interest, and even used that focus of self-interest in government to try to ensure that things performed better than they had under the Articles of Confederation. So that's a very large issue, and if they had as a group, these framers had disagreed over that, they would have spent a lot more time trying to figure out how to get a constitution pointed in a common direction. The second thing that they generally agreed on was that one of the main motivators of political conflict, especially given human nature, which is self-interest, is the division of wealth in society. Who has what, right? And who doesn't? And how do you ensure that those that do have things, that's protected, while at the same time trying to ensure that those that can play by the rules or within the rules can come to have wealth and ownership and some control, relatively speaking, of their lives. So you want both of those things to happen. What you don't want to have happen is this political conflict, this being something that tears the system apart. And they were uniquely aware of the arguments between haves and have-nots, and how if one economic class was favored too much over another, or was penalized more than the other, that led to economic and political revolution, which is exactly what they didn't want. Right? We just come out of a military revolution, political revolution. The last thing we wanted to actually have was a civil war based on divisions of property and wealth. And so they had to keep that in mind as you move forward with the designing a political system, that it has to do two things: protect the wealth that already have it, while providing at least a pathway for people to raise themselves out of economic dire circumstances. So put those two things together, and you come up with the third general idea that they agreed upon philosophically, and that's the purpose of government. When people invest themselves and create property and build wealth, and they do it within a political system, the reason they want to stay in that political system is because it's advantageous to protecting and preserving the property and wealth that they have. So if you want to ensure that society is going to be somewhat stable, that people can have the ability to get out and compete in an economic or capitalist mode and be successful in it, you have to ensure that the political system is preserving the gains of that system. And so looking back at Hobbes and Locke, right, these are the philosophical ideas that they draw out of those two thinkers. They think common. They all tend to agree generally on them, and provided a general basis to write a constitution. And some of these, right, the political conflict and the object of government ideas are very much strong Lockean ideas. The human nature perspective is a Hobbesian idea. So you see both of our major natural rights philosophers reflected in these common ideas here. Does this make sense to everyone? All right. So moving from those common philosophical positions about what government's for and who people are and how they operate, they've got some very practical problems that they have to deal with. I call these all equality problems. One, because they're searching for some kind of political equality that lets them move forward on these issues. Two, because even though they eventually did find compromises that address these, we're still dealing with the equality issues that underlie those concerns today. So the first thing that they had to really hammer out was, how is it that states were going to be represented in the new government? Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had the same exact political equality as other state did. Right? They all had a vote. Didn't matter how big the state was. Didn't matter how populous the state was. Right? the state had one political vote and it carried the same amount of political power as any other state did. And if you were a small state, you liked this idea. Or if you were a lightly populated state, you might like this idea. But if you were on the other side of that, you certainly didn't. And so the larger populous and bigger states were pushing for a different perspective here, right? They wanted to have some recognition of their size and or their population reflected in the way that they got to participate in this new government that they're starting to build. So you had, New Jersey, a small state, wanting to kind of keep the confederal system of voting the same, right? So that each state had one vote in the Congress, and you had Virginia, who is both a large state and a populous state, saying that's really not going to work for us anymore. It's right. You've got to recognize that we're representing more people and more land and probably more wealth, and we should have more of a say at what goes on. So those two states are proposing different ideas about how the states are going to participate in Congress. What we end up with is called the Connecticut Plan, which is a merger of a little bit of both of these, and we'll show you a graph or a picture of that and of how it shakes out in a little bit. But essentially, the idea was to break our legislative body into two bodies, right? The House of Representatives and the Senate, and then require that all legislation go through both the House and the Senate. And then you give, the House of Representatives the Virginia kind of perspective, where they pay attention to population, and the states with more population get more representation in the Senate, in the House. And then the New Jersey side is where the Senate reflects their ideas, where each state has the same amount of representation regardless of population. And then you require legislation to pass both of these houses as bicameral Congress. And so, in a sense, you've compromised to get any legislation to go through both of these processes. Second big issue, which is part and parcel actually of the first issue, because it's part of the population issue, is the issue of slavery. The country at the time was split. Northeastern states, mainly through a lot of their religious background, did not allow slavery. Southern states did. And the Southern states' economy was based upon slave labor and the exploitation of those slaves to generate profit for the states. So we've got this problem of how, if we're going to count population in the House of Representatives, who counts towards population, right? If we're going to base political power in the House upon the number of people in a state, obviously the slave states want everybody to count toward their population and then their representation. And then the non-slave states are arguing, of course, that, we should only count citizens. There wasn't going to be an either-or solution on this issue. Neither side was going to compromise in the sense of going all the way to one position or the other. So we came up with the horrendous idea, but politically effective compromises, coming up with a 3/5 count of slaves to count toward a population of a state, which then counts toward the representation of that state in the House. And it was essentially just a political bargain to allow the states to move forward, because they weren't going to come to any other kind of solution at the time. And as we know, such a contentious, and ought to be a contentious debate about this. Anytime that you're subjecting humans to slavery, you should, right, really be putting some attention to this issue. Today, of course, when we look at it, we have a hard time fathoming that at any point that there was, slavery a legitimate way of treating people. But we have to recognize our history and what's spun out of that history as part of our history, our political history, and our social history, because it's a large part of who we are as a country and where we are today as a country. And so we've been dealing with this issue unsuccessfully or in a piecemeal fashion since the late 1700s, and we still don't have still haven't recovered from it in a really good way yet. The third issue here is the actual political equality of states versus a national government, and how it is that you have some balance of power between the federal government that they're building and the state governments that are giving up some control and giving up some power to allow this national government to expand. And so the states wanted consideration, the states wanted some kind of guarantees on being able to control this federal government to some extent, right? Because the recognition that they had under the Articles of Confederation was that having a unitary system of government like they did, where the states were in control and had all the power and told the federal government what it could do, that didn't work very well. So they had to give some unilateral power to the federal government. Of course, at the point you start empowering some other political system, you as a state government, and all of these fellows were state legislators in some form or fashion, had been or were, so they're giving up literally political power to a federal system. And they were concerned about that. So they were like, how do we ensure that the states still have some ability to control what's going on with this federal government, where it's going through time? And one of the strongest controls that they could put into place was to situate elections down into the states, and to set those states the actual voting requirements in those elections. And we still have this today, where there are some basic federal guidelines about how you vote, when you vote, but most of the controls in place about how we elect people to the federal government are controlled by state law. And so all of the representatives from a state that get elected to the federal government get elected from following the political and procedural perspectives of state elections and following state laws. And so this was to put a kind of hedge against the federal government getting out of control, because the states, in a large sense, just controlled who the representatives at the federal level were going to be. And therefore, anybody that was elected to federal government was elected using the power and scope of a state government and state election laws. So this was a balance of equality of power between the federal government and the states, right? The first two were equality issues between the states, right? So these three equality issues make sense. I mean, these were the dominant compromises that had to be made to allow us to move from a confederal system to a federal system. And I think, yes, I have some images out of the text, to give you a little bit of a perspective of what we're talking about here, The Virginia plan looking at population, the New Jersey plan, Virginia plan over here looking at population, wanting representation in Congress based upon that. New Jersey plan here, so this is our first equality issue, right? And then the Connecticut plan kind of merged these two together. So you should have seen these before looking through your text, right? And then here is equality issue number 2, right? The image that goes along with that is we try to decide proportionality of people in the states that get to count toward the seats in the House of Representatives, and what the 3/5 compromise did. And then I think we have one more. Nope, don't have one more. Okay. So any questions about the big compromises here that helped, right, us move from a confederal system, right, to a federal system? You've probably, right, talked about this in your government classes before. So one of the other big sticking points in this new Constitution was to try to figure out how it is that you protect individuals from the federal government. You can imagine that our framers of our Constitution were particularly concerned about individual protections, and they had just come through a revolution against a monarchy, wanting to make sure that a lot of the individual grievances that were in place of how the monarchy dealt with its subjects were solved or prevented from ever occurring as we moved forward. And so the idea here is in the Constitution, right, because we have a belief that this organization of government written down in a Constitution will be followed, that we would put some protections for the individual, right? Some way of ensuring that individuals as a whole could not be just run roughshod over by the federal government, especially when it came to issues of criminal law. And so when we look at our Constitution, the original Constitution before the amendments, right, we see a focus on mainly criminal process of how a federal government would accuse someone of a crime, try someone for a crime, how it would treat that individual after they have been accused until they're found guilty. And so we see these individual protections put into the original Constitution. The first one is a protection against the suspension of habeus corpus. So this is a little convoluted, but the practice of habeas corpus was a practice of ensuring that whatever the government was gave access to those people that were being held as they awaited trial, right? That there would be some accountability so that people didn't disappear. And coming out of the English common law, there was a practice of habeas corpus, and that's Latin, and it literally means deliver up the body, right? So someone gets arrested, they get thrown into jail awaiting a court date. People should be able to go into the penal system, into the jail system, and say, was this person arrested and where are they, and show us, right? So that people didn't just disappear. Now, one of the problems that we had under King George was that King George at times would suspend, right, the practice of habeas corpus, the practice of letting people keep track of who the arrested were and where they were. So he would suspend habeas corpus. We wanted to ensure that that possibility of suspension was not a practice that carried over as we moved in to this new federal system. And so the new federal government that was going to come out of this Constitution, right, could never suspend habeas corpus. In other words, if the federal government, right, accused someone of a crime and arrested them, it had to be a very public process, what they were doing with them, where they were, what they'd been charged with, all of this, right? So it was in a sense trying to ensure that the federal government, if it ever took action against individuals, did it in the light of day, right? That people could follow it, people could be aware of what was going on. So this, right, prohibition against a suspension of habeas corpus, or in other words, saying that we would always keep habeas corpus as a right, is written into the original Constitution. And if you've ever paid attention to any of foreign governments, especially ones that are dictatorial, you do know that individuals, right, get picked up by their federal governments, and no one hears from them again, right? And this is what this is trying to address, to make sure that this isn't something that occurs in our system. Does that make sense? Right. I mean, it's a little confusing because it's almost a double negative there, right? A prohibition of the suspension of habeas corpus. So I want to make sure that makes sense. Okay. Second individual protection that we can look to the Constitution and see written into it is a prohibition on bills of attainder. So when someone is arrested, a bill of attainder would be issued that said, you will be tried at this date, this time, this place, right? Here's what you have been charged with. Here's, right? So basically the facts of the accusation and the arrest. And what they didn't want to have is someone getting arrested and then held indefinitely, right? So a bill of attainder saying, we're going to hold you until we can have a trial. No, you can't do that, right? It can't be undetermined. It has to be something that is clear cut and straightforward. So magistrate couldn't issue a bill of attainder, or basically arrest warrant, and then let that sit without ever scheduling a trial. So when that arrest happens, when a warrant is issued, or when a police officer arrests someone, part of the process is, right, to get the court system moving as we bring someone into it. You just can't let them sit indefinitely in a cell and say, yeah, we'll eventually get to you, and then you don't, right? So you didn't want people to just disappear. You also didn't want them to just waste away in prison before they ever got their day in court. And so a prohibition of a bill of attainder ensured that, right, when they were arrested, they were put into a process of some kind that would ensure they would get their opportunity to defend themselves. This next one is one of my favorites. It's a prohibition against an ex post facto law. The fact that you ever needed this is just kind of crazy. Ex post facto is Latin. It means after the fact. And what this is, a prohibition, is against punishing people for breaking a law that hasn't been passed when they did the action. So let me give you an example and it becomes more clear. Let's say you're driving down the street and the speed limit on that street is 50 miles an hour. And you drive the speed limit, right? You're not a lawbreaker, you drive the speed limit. And on, what's today? Today's is September the 7th or something, not 8th. So on September 8th, we passed a law saying the speed limit, changing the speed limit, and now it's 40 miles an hour. On September 7th, there was a police officer that knew you and saw you driving 50 miles an hour on that road. The law changed, right? And then the next day he shows up at your house and says, hey, remember you were driving 50 on that road? Well, now the speed limit is 40, so I'm going to write you a ticket, right? You can't enforce a law that's been passed after the fact for behavior that's occurred before it, right? So you can't make something illegal and then go punish people for doing it prior to it becoming illegal. Now, this never occurred to me that this could be a problem, right? That anybody would do this. But the very fact that it's written into our Constitution shows us that there was historical cases of, we don't like what you have been doing, so we're going to pass a law now and then punish you for what you did before it became a law. Right? We were doing that. So it's just it's kind of crazy, and I enjoy it because of that. It's a little different. But this is one of the protections that was written into the new Constitution coming out of Philadelphia. One that we don't consider all of that relevant today because we've got a political culture and a history that has respected it for a long time. But this wasn't the case at the time, is the prohibition against religious qualifications for any national office. What that means is that when you put requirements into place for what people that have to meet to be qualified to run for an office, none of those qualifications can be religious qualifications. In other words, you can't say to be president of the United States, you must be Baptist, or you must be Catholic, or you can't be Muslim, right? Something you can't put a prohibition based on a religious qualification in place. This was common practice in a lot of other nations, and actually it was not uncommon in the state, some of the states, that they would have religious qualifications for office. And so this was a real issue at the time. Texas actually still has a law on in the Constitution that says that you have to have a belief in a higher power to be eligible to run for office. Kind of looks like a religious qualification script. It hasn't been changed. It hasn't been challenged because no one's ever paid attention to it, right? And it's, we know that we've had atheists run for office, and no one has challenged them on that, saying, no, you have to have a belief in a divine presence or higher being. So it's still there. But at the time that it was written, right, time that it went into place has been 1870s, right, 1876, I guess. There was not a contentious, debatable fact, right, that it would, we wanted folks in Texas running for office to be religious in some nature. Right? It was a prohibition basically against atheists running for office. That's not good. That's not correct. That's not constitutional, but it's there. And we just haven't practiced it, so no one's bothered to change it. But this was at the national level, right? We're putting something in place that was outlawing that to begin with, right? No religious qualifications. That doesn't mean you can't be religious or anything like that. It just means that, right, the qualifications for that office that you have to meet to be able to run for it, like, say, being president, you've got to be a U.S. citizen, right? A natural born U.S. citizen, 35 years old, lived here, right, for 12 or 14 years before an election. Those are qualifications for office. One of those cannot be that you have a religious perspective of any kind, right? So it's just a way of trying to ensure that our federal government didn't, over time, become looking like the English government, right? The monarch and the Parliament of England, where they kept having religious wars, and you had to be of the right religion at the right time to be elected to office or to be appointed monarch. So we're trying to avoid that situation. I find the next one here on the list particularly telling. Right? They've been a definition of treason into the Constitution, and the idea being they wanted to define up front what was treason and what wasn't treason, right, by what they didn't put in there. And of course, the reason here is kind of going back to that idea of human nature, that people are self-interested. Our framers were all, to some extent, right, treasonous. They had rebelled against the monarchy of England, and they were still a little concerned about the royalists in the states, and that they might get elected to office, and that they might sometime down the road want to punish, right, some of these folks that were against the monarchy. And so, as a hedge against that, you define politically and in the Constitution what constitutes treason, and make sure that what you did is not part of that definition. And so that's what they did. They defined treason to be actions that were directly against the government, right, that is enforced from this Constitution, taking actions against it. So, and not the ones that we came from. The last one here is actually guaranteeing a right to a trial by jury in criminal cases. So this, of course, is coming from a concern that the federal government might try to determine the outcome of a trial, and especially if it's a criminal trial that's maybe based upon political actions or ambitions, right? They wanted to ensure that if a person was going to be found guilty in a criminal trial, that they were found guilty by a jury and not by a judge that was appointed politically, right? And might be trying to enforce some perspective from a political party or a political appointee. And so they wanted to draw a trial by jury, hopefully to deliver some kind of impartiality in the deliverance of justice when someone is found guilty or not. So in a sense, it acts as a nice break against political power at the national level, because when you're going to use the power of government to convict someone here, you've got to be able to convince a jury, and as they wrote it, a jury of their peers, to take their freedom away from them. You just don't let the government do it on their own basis and their own power. Yes? Questions? Concerns? All right, hearing none, we will move forward. As we started, actually, the founding fathers started talking about how to put this system together. And they had these equality notions that they were working over, and they had these individual protections they were trying to ensure. They were also looking at the structure of the government they were going to build. And James Madison was the preeminent, I guess, internal structure expert on this. Prior to the Constitutional Convention, Madison had been researching all the previous historical forms of democracy that had existed, that people knew about, that had been written about. The winter before the summer Constitutional Convention, Madison actually writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson and says, who had the biggest and most extensive library in the states at the time, we believe. And he wrote a letter to him saying, hey, if you would, I'd love for you to go through your library and pull out all of the texts you have, the histories and such that you have on democracies, and ship them to me so I can study up on them, because when we have this convention, we want to make sure as we're putting this new democracy together that we avoid all of the problems and failures that others had had. And so Madison was kind of the historian of record for failed democracies that was being referenced during the Constitutional Convention, right? He'd done all the study, he'd done all the work. And obviously Jefferson did do this. And so he put this effort in and was able to speak to problems other democracies or democratically inclined governments had tried to do as they through history. And so they were one of the things that came out of this, or the themes that came out of it, was trying to find some way to ensure that the government as a whole had a balance of power among the elements of government, and a balance of power between the government itself and the people outside of government that were voting and getting elected into office. So he wanted to ensure, right, that everything in this government, right, he had some oversight from somewhere else, or some countervailing power that required compromise. So the first thing that comes to the fore here is a concern about how a straight up strict majoritarian system, right, can become, right, demagogic in a sense and can become completely controlling. If you have a majority in the Senate and a majority in the House, and the president is of the same party, right, you're a little concerned with what all the power that that group has. Now, obviously, if you're going to call yourself a republic that's democratic in nature, you've got to let the majority, right, vote, and let the majority will determine where this system is going. That's the whole point of a democratic system. But you don't want to let the mere majority completely and easily restructure the whole fundamental foundations of government. So you want to make sure that any structural changes, any real in-depth, right, infrastructure kind of changes for the government itself are beyond mere majority control. And if you look at our Constitution, you look at the process, and we'll do this at the end of this chapter, you look at the processes that are in place, the majority, right, 50% plus one, cannot change the design of government. They can certainly pass laws, right, and put legislation into place, but they can't change the actual form or function of government with just a majority vote. So while they can certainly be putting policy into place that recognizes what the majority want, they can't change the organization of government. They can't change the policy-making procedures of government with just a mere majority, right? We'll discuss when we get to how we amend the Constitution, how you have to do that, right? Or how we set that up. The second thing that Madison learned by reading through all of this and expressed to the body there was, you can't have one center of power in the federal government. You're going to have to spread power out, and you're going to have to make sure that power that is being exercised has countervailing powers in other places. And so if you look, right, at the different powers of the institutions, the idea is that they all kind of have the ability to oversee one another. They have the ability to force different parts of the government to work together to get anything done. There's not one part of government that can just do what they want to do and be completely outside of any other oversight or constraint. And to get anything done requires more than one part of government to get along, right? So if you want to pass new legislation, right, the Congress has to pass a bill, right, that is exactly the same in both the House and the Senate, but it can't become law unless the president signs it or the majority of the House and the Senate is so strong that they could override a veto of the president. So, right, the idea there is the power of the presidency acts as a check and a balance on the appetites and the whims and beliefs of the representatives. The House of Representatives, which is supposed to represent the more common folk of the country, and the Senate, right, the more upper crust of the country, they have to agree on the same thing in a piece of legislation. It never even gets to the president. So they each hold powers, right, that have to work together. And then the president's power has to come in. And that's just one example, but, right, power exists in these different places. And for things to get done requires the use of power in those different places, several of them, to get things done. The last thing was then the extension of checks and balances between the different parts of government, right? So we're seeing today, obviously, some challenges to these checks and balances that exist between the institutions, right? We have a president who is, right, feeling constrained by a Democratic House and trying to get things done that he thinks are important, with only the power of his own institution, the presidency, right, and is doing some things that are completely right unheard of, historically have never been done, and we have right House, which was majority of the other party, saying that's not the way we do things here. You can't do that. Well, they have to use their right checks and balances to try to stop that. And one of the biggest ones that the House has is the power of the purse. And so, right, they have to look at how they can use money as a way to balance out the power between the House and the presidency. Right, the courts have the ability to exercise court checks and balances on constitutionality of legislation that is passed. Constitutionality of implementation from the executive branch. So what Madison has argued for here and gets designed and put into the Constitution is that the different parts of government, right, not only have to work with each other to get things done, but they also have ensconced in the Constitution the ability to provide oversight over different parts of government, right, and to try to correct behavior that they think is unconstitutional or is illegal in the sense that it goes against legislation that's been passed. So these are the three big areas where you see Madison trying to right ensure that things can get done, but when they get done within this political system, lots of pieces and parts have come together to make that happen. And we still right are working these issues as we should be today, right? We're still concerned about them. This is figure right here, again, out of the book, is one that's, I think, incredibly important as it lays out constitutionally the powers, right, that the institutions has, as well as the checks and balances that they have between the three branches of government. So I would spend some time with this figure, this chart here, familiarizing yourself with which institution can do what and which oversight there is over the others, right? So, right, this is just recognizing these ideas that Madison was arguing for and was recognized and approved by other framers of the Constitution. The one thing you don't want is one element of the federal government getting too strong and being able to do whatever they want without the other parts of government either coming in and agreeing with that or having the opportunity to stop that. So they each need to cooperate to get anything done, and each group has some ability to use their power to restrict the power of the other elements of government. And like I said before, right now we're seeing a large ongoing challenge between the legislature and the executive branch as to who decides what gets done and how. And there's occasionally you'll see the Supreme Court get involved in determining whether legislative policy or legislation from the legislature or policy from the president has gone too far one direction or the other and is deemed unconstitutional or outside the structures the Constitution is laid out for these institutions. So it's a good read to spend some time with this chart, right? To go through it a little bit and make sure you understand where we're at. Now, a lot of this is when you read this, there's no brilliant flashes of right, I didn't understand. Most of this is pretty rote. It's pretty standard kind of stuff, and you're probably aware of it. But it's right. It's important that you know it. We have, through practice, watched these institutions maybe gain power or let other institutions exercise power that they haven't had strictly through the Constitution. And so if you're paying attention as you read through this, right? You're going to see some things and you're going to go, wait a minute, that doesn't seem to be the way that always works. What's going on here? And some of that is just historical change in an idea of what's appropriate today versus 200 years ago or so. But the Constitution still lays this out as different domains of activity. And what I'm thinking of in particular here is the power to declare war versus the power to engage in war, right? Your president is your commander in chief, right? They control the military in a sense and lead the military branches. But the constitutional power to actually declare war exists over in the legislature. The president does not have the authority to declare war. But in today's world, it wouldn't be prudent to always have to go to a legislature and argue your point and have legislation passed to declare war before you could use force in the world, especially outside the country and internationally. And so historically, right, we have been letting presidents make a determination of the use and engagement of military force, and then in a sense requiring them to work with the legislature over time to ensure that what they're doing is proper and that the legislature approves of it. That's not the way this is designed, but it's the way that we've worked it out. And we'll talk about that as we move through the semester. But that's one of the places you can see that the original design doesn't accurately portray the actual practice. Okay, so you've got these big ideas, you've got these balance of power issues, you've got these concerns about equality that have to be met. You have a lot of debate that's going on, and what you see in the Constitutional Convention is the development of two different factions of folks. Federalist on one side. These are the individuals that are thinking they've got a good new constitution here and they want to get it ratified. The design will work. It's sufficient for what they're looking for, and it's time to move forward. The second faction are the anti-federalists, right? Not into unique names here, just kind of normative and descriptive. The anti-federalists are those folks somewhat against this new federal proposal that's being laid out there as a new constitution. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are your two groups that are arguing in the Constitutional Convention. And very prominent framers, right, of the Constitution, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, are Federalists, right? They're the ones that have organized and kind of put the process out there and said, here's what we want. This will work, right? We need to get all of you states on board with this. We need to get all of you state legislators and delegates that are here on board with this, right? So we can move forward. We've got to get away from this Articles of Confederation, which is letting one individual state hamstring the whole process if they want. The Anti-Federalists, generally speaking, agreed, right, that there need to be something done, or they wouldn't have been at the Constitutional Convention. But they were definitely concerned that the bias that were being written into this Constitution were too one-sided, right? That this new Constitution put too much emphasis on those that had property, protecting, right, the wealth and the interest of the property at the time. And so they basically told us this is a class-based document, right? And it's class-based to emphasize wealth, and it's class-based to emphasize political power, right? Those that already have it are going to be able to hold on to it easily, and a lot of other people may be blocked out of this. So they were concerned about the design of the document and kind of the overall direction of that document. Second thing that was important to them is that although there were some individual criminal rights protection that we already discussed in the Constitution, there were a whole lot of individual rights that were not in the Constitution. And they were concerned that the federal government might violate them. Now, the reason this was upfront and recognized is that a lot of the state constitutions at the time had already at the state level instituted more individual rights than this new proposed constitution was doing. And so you've got these delegates from the states going, well, you know, our state protects the rights of an individual, right, to have representation at trial, maybe, or to have freedom of speech, maybe, or and it differed from state to state what the individual right might have been, but they were concerned that there was a whole host of rights that could have been in this Constitution that weren't. And so that bothered them. And then, of course, it was a necessary part of the process, right, to get a working federal government that you took power away from the states to put it in the federal government's hands. And that everybody understood that, but they didn't all agree on what that power that should be transferred from the states to the federal government, what it should be and how it should work. And so they had some concerns about that. So the Anti-Federalists were focused on at least these three issues, and the Federalists, to be successful, were going to have to overcome these concerns to see it, before a ratification of that Constitution could happen. So how do you do that? Well, if you're going to try to make sure that the states that are concerned about giving up state power, right, can't put a roadblock in front of this, then you don't let the state governments have a say in the ratification of the new Constitution. So the design here that's put into place is a special convention, right, that allows the federal government to be ratified without making it go necessarily to a state legislature, which was the process prior to this, for ratification. It could, but it didn't have to. So you build another way to ratify what you want to escape the problem approach. The second thing you do here is, right, get out there and market your ideas, right? And that's what we see in the publication of the Federalist Papers. One of the states that was in the midst of trying to figure out whether they were going to support this or not was New York. And so the Federalists made a big push, right, by publishing their papers, what became collectively known as the Federalist Papers. And you can go out and get a copy of that now and read. These were missives that were printed in the paper, the daily papers in New York, to try to convince the populace of New York, and then by that their representatives as well, to go along and to support this new Constitution that was being proposed. And New York was right, kind of a linchpin state that needed to be there. And so that's how they're trying to get their message out there. The final thing is they conceded on the individual rights issue. They said, you're right, we don't have a lot of these in place. We kind of didn't think we needed them because the states were protecting them. And the states control the elections, so the people elected to federal government would probably make sure they were protected too. But there's no reason that we can't, right, protect those. But, and this is the really remarkable thing of a point of this issue here, the Federalists argue to the Anti-Federalists, we'll give you the rights that you want. We'll ensconce those or enshrine those in government, but don't make us do it now. We don't have time to go back and debate all of them right now, rewrite the Constitution, get them all into place. Take our word that when the new government is put into place, the first things we'll do is focus on getting these individual rights protected. Look at our political spectrum today and our political atmosphere today, and could we have, right, an opposition, right, say, trust me, we'll give this to you after you do what we want by putting us into power. Right? That's a non-starter today. But between the Federalists and the Anti-federalists, right, the integrity there, the belief and concern that existed between the people debating at this, that was enough. And so the promise was made that there would be a Bill of Rights that would come into play after this. And as we see, obviously, it happened, right? The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, was passed not too long after that and met this promise that had been given to the Anti-federalists by the Federalists. Well, it's really a phenomenal thing when you think about it, that that trust was there, that political integrity was there at the time between the framers, that they could say, give us this one and we guarantee you will get what you want down the road. And then the nice part, of course, was that they delivered, right? And we got the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So speaking of that Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, right? Oh, we got a little artifact here on the slide that didn't come across, right? Right, when you're passing an amendment to the Constitution, you follow the rules that are in the Constitution about changing that Constitution. I talked earlier about putting the power of the infrastructure and the design of government beyond the mere majority. And in the Constitution, right, we have put that process here into place that requires, right, 2 supermajority votes, right, which a supermajority vote, right, is well beyond a mere majority, beyond just the majority. And so there are 4 different parts that can come into play in ratifying a change to the Constitution. There are 2 stages. Each stage has 2 possible ways of moving through that stage. The first stage of changing our Constitution is to propose an amendment to that Constitution, which is a right formal action. We're proposing to change the structures, right, the guidelines and the rules of government by this amendment to the Constitution. There are 2 different ways that you can propose an amendment to the Constitution. One, Congress can propose, right? So the House and the Senate together can propose an amendment to the Constitution. And if they can get 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, you have a formal proposal, right, to change the Constitution. And that's the process we've always used. However, the second process to propose a change to the Constitution is one that originates outside of the federal government, right? The states can call a national convention of states, and in that national convention of states can propose a change to the federal Constitution. And if 2/3 of the states, right, ratify that proposed amendment, then it is a legitimate proposal to change the Constitution. So what they've done here is they've given us, right, a practice where our elected representatives can change the structure of government, propose to change the structure of government, or, right, each of the states, and through those representatives at the state levels, the states can organize a convention and the states can change the federal government, which is reserving a right power of oversight to the states, because anything that's in the Constitution could be changed by this if it was done the right way. So 1A and 1B, stage 1, right, the proposal process. You have A and B as different ways of doing it. One is through the federal government, one is through the state governments. Both 1A and 1B require a supermajority vote of 2/3 to propose a change to the Constitution. Once you have a properly proposed amendment to the Constitution, then you move to the ratification step, which is step 2. And there are 2 different ways you can ratify a proposal and make it part of the Constitution. One, that proposal from the Congress or the convention can come to state legislatures, and those state legislatures can vote to ratify that. So in other words, the folks that we elect in Texas to represent us in the state legislature of Texas, right? A proposed change to the US Constitution could come down into the Texas state legislature, and they would vote, right, as our representatives at the state level to ratify or not a proposal to change the Constitution. Notice here that the legislature ratification process requires 3/4 of the states to ratify a change, right? So we have 66% or 2/3, right, to get a proposal out there, but 75% or 3/4 of the states to actually make it happen. And 2A is the process that we have used for ratifying all of the amendments to the Constitution except the 21st Amendment. And while I'm rattling on about this, someone look up what the 21st Amendment is. You'll be pleasantly surprised. It's kind of funny. 2B, the second option for ratification of a proposal, is that the states can call convention, right, and ratify it through a vote of the populations of the states. And if 3/4 of the states, right, have their populace vote on it, and 3/4 of those, I mean, if all of the states do it, and 3/4 of the states vote in the affirmative, then the states, through their popular vote, can ratify, right, the proposal. So you would have a convention at the state level, and the states would vote it through that way, which bypasses state legislatures. This was the process that we actually used to approve the 21st Amendment, right? Is that what happened to the 15th Amendment? The 15th Amendment was a congressional proposal and a state legislature ratification. Now you got to remember the 15th Amendment, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are the Civil Rights Amendments. And the state legislatures had been essentially packed with Yankees, Federalists, folks from the northern states that were brought down by the federal government and put into power in the state governments in the South to ensure, right, that the changes needed to get rid of slavery and to ensure that, right, our African Americans in the South could vote, right? We went through the period of Reconstruction where the federal government, through its appointees and the people it sent to the South, right, tried to reconstruct how the state governments work and bring them back into line with how the rest of the states of the federal government work, right? US government. So the folks voting at the states legislatures were actually, right, put there in a large sense. They were elected, but they were, right, supported and by the federal government and by the folks that were reconstructing the South. The 21st Amendment is the one where we used state conventions. Has anybody looked it up yet? The 21st Amendment, thank you, the repeal of the prohibition of alcohol, right? The 20th Amendment, right, prohibited alcohol. That didn't fly long. And the 21st Amendment, right, repealed the 20th Amendment. And the reason we use state conventions is because the state legislatures and the folks that have been elected to state legislatures were still not on board with repealing prohibition on alcohol. But the populace of the states definitely were. And so we went around our state legislatures, had state conventions to make sure that we could have our beer. Was the 18th? Okay. I'd have to look to be absolutely positive on it. And so, right, that's the only time that we've kind of gone away from the 1A, 2A approach to changing our Constitution, right? But the 1B is there, 2B is there, right, as alternates that go around legislatures, right? Right now, there is, right, a number of states that are trying to pull together a national convention, right? And the idea behind the national convention is that they're going to, right, propose amendments to the federal constitution. I don't remember the number of states that are doing that, that have obligated themselves to that right now. Texas is one of them, though. That if enough states can get on board, that we will have a national convention of the states, and then we will propose changes to the Constitution. There's not solid agreement as to what the new proposals might be. Some states want different things from other states, but a lot of states are apparently starting to organize to try to get a convention of the states. I'm going to jump over and try to find that real quick. So they have a website called Convention of the States. Let me see if I can share this page real quick. So this is kind of their landing page, conventionofstates.com. They're trying to get this to go. So here are the states that have either blue or green are actually working on something. Yellow is halfway through the process. Green, as the chart says here, is a state that has passed a convention of the state resolution saying they want to have one. Blue states are states that have passed legislation that say they want to have one, or have legislation working this year to get one. And then yellow shows us states that are partially through the process. And then white are the states that are not involved in doing this right now. So it's at any point where enough of the states get behind it, it's possible that we could have a convention of the states to start maybe talking about proposals to change the Constitution. For any ratification to come out of this, right, you would need 38 states, I think, to ratify a proposal out of the 50. So it would, let's see, we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So 10 are not doing anything, which means there are more than enough. 11, sorry, there's Delaware. So it looks like 11. There's Rhode Island therein. Okay. 11 states are not interested right now enough to even start the process. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 or so states are definitely there and waiting. And another 10 or 12 that are well into the process, and another 8 or so that are 7 or 8 that are working it. So it's certainly possible that we could have a convention of the states going forward. Notice that the driving force of it seems to be right southern and western states. So I would hazard a guess that it looks somewhat conservative in its approach. All right, let's get back to our presentation, our slides. something to keep an eye on, though. And if it happens and we get anything out of it, it'll be the first time. I think. Almost. Okay. So there we are. So we're back on the process of changing the Constitution. So this two-step process, right, is our documented way of changing the infrastructure and the Constitution of the United States. This is the formal process of changing powers, changing institutions, changing who has the ability to do what. Again, we've not done it a lot in the 250 years that we've been there. More often, what we do is we change the Constitution by changing informal process, changing interpretation of what something says. And so this is the last slide of this chapter, is talking about, right, this change. And I think I have gone over time, so I will shut up and we will come back and do informal changes to the Constitution tomorrow.